The Mounts of Mayhem drop has just been announced, with it showing off the new Nautilus mob, reintroducing zombie horses into survival after over 12 years, and introducing a new weapon, the spear. With all of these new additions, however, it feels as if a few things are missing. Which raises the question, what is Minecraft's newest drop still missing? But before we talk about that, let's do a quick recap of what the features we already have will do. The Nautilus is a new tameable mob, being able to be befriended with pufferfish and allowing the player to ride it at high speeds when submerged in water. It's another way to get around underwater besides dolphins, boats, and Riptide, with the zombie Nautilus being the evil counterpart of the Nautilus, giving drowns a new means to chase after players. Now back on land, not only is the zombie horse being reintroduced after 12 years, it's also bringing a new weapon with it, the spear. The spear is a new melee weapon that deals more damage proportional to the player's horizontal movement speed, very similar to the mace, which does the same, but based on the player's falling distance. The only thing that concerns me about the spear, however, is that it can be made out of any resource for the same material cost as a shovel. But still, like I said in the intro, it feels like something's missing, especially considering the fact that the drop is so focused on the Nautilus. So let's start with that. Now, the first thing that I thought of when I was brainstorming was giving the Nautilus Shell more uses, and considering that it has a singular crafting recipe, this is very needed. So let's start simple by making a Nautilus Shell block, which is better for storing shells and could be a very interesting decoration if used properly. Another addition I'd like to see is a use for the Nautilus Shell item itself. I actually brought up this point in my resource rework video a few months ago, which you should totally check out by the way. And in that video, I mentioned being able to blow into the Nautilus Shell, kind of like a conch shell, with it having a similar functionality to the scrap copper horns, and being able to play one of 3 different notes based on where the player is looking, like this. Now, this feature is purely cosmetic. However, despite that being the case, it is also the main catalyst for some of the new features I'll be suggesting, with the first one of those being the echoing shell. Now, what does the echoing shell actually do? Well, if you decide to head underground and blow into it, you'll notice that the ores around you become a lot more visible, with them having a white glowing outline around them. Now, the recipe for this item could be an echo shard and the singular Nautilus shell. And in order to prevent it from being too overpowered, it will have 3 durability before breaking. However, once it does, you'll get your Nautilus shell back, but the echo shard will be consumed. Additionally, every ore will glow the same color, but that's just because the point of this item isn't directly to lead the player to any resource at any given time, but rather to nudge them in the right direction. Another item with a very similar functionality is the crystalline shell, which essentially does the same thing as the echoing shell, except it highlights all mobs in a nearby area, including players. The crystalline shell also has a very similar recipe as well, with the echo shard being replaced by an amethyst one. However, unlike the echoing shell, the crystalline shell will only have 1 durability, and be able to highlight entities for a longer period of time. Both items could be super helpful, and not only provide more uses for Nautilus shells, but for amethyst and echo shards as well, which are both lacking a lot of uses in my opinion. I also came up with a few underwater themed decoration blocks, just because I thought they'd be fun, with those being the buoy, shell tiles, stairs, and slabs. And while I'm telling you about these blocks, I'd like to point something out. You might have noticed that I actually have these items, and that's because they're actually real, and I made a mod to add them all in, and you can play with them for free. All you have to do is get this video to 1,000 likes and it's yours. The mod is called Nautical, and it will be the first link in the description whenever that goal is hit. Thank you! Anyways, back on track. Hopefully these would help to flesh out Nautilus shells even more, making them somewhat more like a resource with a similar amount of uses to something like gold. Now, as much as I love the aquatic features, there's an entire other half of this update to cover, with that being the spears and zombie horses. I love the spears, and I am super excited to see the return of zombie horses, but there are definitely a few things to consider for both. First of all, I'd love for zombie horses to have a unique mechanic to horses. Maybe by having them be slower, but riding on them significantly reduces the range at which zombies target players. I think that some kind of gimmick to incentivize people to use them as a means of early game transportation, kind of like how skeleton horses can be ridden underwater, which, now that I'm thinking about it, is kind of useless because of the Nautilus, would be really cool. But still, even if they don't do that, it's fun to theorize. And something else that I'd like to see is maybe a netherite tier for horse armor. I don't particularly care to use horses when I play Minecraft, but I always found it kind of strange that Mojang never added another tier for horse armor. Maybe this could also allow for some horse-specific enchantments, which would be really cool to see, but I'm not sure. Now, moving on to the spears, I think that they're lacking a few things, with the main one of those right now being enchantments. As it is right now, the spear has just been shown off, and so it makes sense that there's no enchantments for it yet. However, seeing as it's a weapon, very similar to the mace, with movement being essential to use it, an enchantment with movement in mind seems very fitting for it. Let's call it vaulting, and with vaulting, the player will be able to perform a dash, highly increasing the speed and damage output of the player for about a second. Another enchantment that would be really cool to see would be something that pierces through shields. Kind of like how the mace has breach to deal extra damage through armor, puncturing could deal damage to a target regardless of whether or not they had a shield active. Although if they were hiding behind the shield, maybe the spear would do reduced damage, maybe around 60% of what they would have taken if they weren't shielded. Additionally, a jousting enchantment which does extra knockback when on a mount would be really fun to play around with, and it would add a new dynamic to PvP that we'd get with mounts, which we're already getting to an extent because of the spear, but it'd be fun to expand on that further. Finally, something else that I would like to see would be being able to tip the spear with potions, and giving temporary status effects on hit would be a really unique feature, with it spicing up combat through different effects. I think it'd be really fun if the effects had a secondary durability bar, which would allow players to use multiple effects on different targets. And that's all of my ideas. All things considered, I am a huge fan of the Nautilus and the spears. And to answer the question I asked at the start of the video, I think that the drop is missing a couple of things. As a whole, the announcement felt a little small, and it felt like it was lacking a few features, but that's to be expected. The update was announced very recently, and it makes sense as to why they've shown as much as they have. And these were just my ideas to fill in for that. But those are just my thoughts, and if you have any other ideas, tell me in the comments. I'd love to see them. Anyways, bye bye, subscribe, bye bye.